What's up, girls? I finished writing my first novel, Love Begins with Elle, back in October, 8 months ago, and I've been trying to submit it to literary agencies or get it to a publisher, um, but I've kind of been having trouble. No one really seems to be responding to my emails, um, and so I just thought it might be a good thing to put out like a book pitch here online. If anyone knows any publishers or literary agents or anyone that might be interested in this book, please connect me with them. I'm just trying to take, any action that I can to get this book published. I really believe in it. So, yeah, let me know. Thank you. Um, so, the book is a love story from the perspective of death. Death is personified by like a human man living in a modern American city. Um, and the idea is that like people don't really like to think about death in their day-to-day life, and so the character of death is like very socially isolated. On the other hand, though, he thinks he plays like a very important role in society, um, and so he kind of feels like wrongfully isolated. He feels kind of important, and it's a little bit of a backdoor into the psychology of like a socially isolated but smart, competent male, which is very um, prevalent right now, very in vogue. Um, and the thing is, like, he's also like very cynical and kind of looks down at everyone because, like, he makes it out so that everybody else is beneath him. Um, because then the isolation kind of becomes his choice. And if the isolation's his choice, then it's not as bad. It's like a coping mechanism a little bit. Um, the issue with that, though, with that kind of defense mechanism, is that you're not really able to connect with people because like you're not able to put yourself out there with someone. You can't reach out to someone if they're beneath you. So he's kind of trapped by his own defense mechanism, and that's caused him to be bitter and whatever. The book is written in first person, and it's a little bit monologic or essayistic. I try to make him very funny and kind of use the like fact that he's deaf to create a lot of irony. He loves Diet Cokes. He loves McDonald's. He loves candy. He smokes cigarettes. Marlboro Reds, whatever. Um, he I guess the book starts off the first three chapters. You don't know that he's deaf. You just think he's kind of this crazy guy um, who. I start off with the B story, which is kind of the thematic through line, which is that he lives in a penthouse apartment and he wants to board up the main like floor to ceiling window that's in his apartment because he can't stand the light coming into his apartment anymore. And the window is supposed to serve as this like metaphor for like the awareness of mortality, that like he he can see things through it, but they're not the actual thing. There is a thin translucent layer on his like ability to see, um, and that's his awareness of mortality. Even though he himself is immortal, he can't really cope with the idea of death, and he's like not really able to comprehend it logically, which I think is true for a lot of people. Um, so he like calls up his building manager and he's trying to get the window boarded up, but there's all this like kind of bureaucratic red tape, and then he tries to hire a guy out of pocket to do it for him. The whole time he's just mad and upset that no one will help him board up his window. Um, and then chapter two, he goes to a therapist. He tries to talk to the therapist. He has this like real, you know, earnest desire to kind of be happy. Um, but the therapist can't even really talk to him because the therapist, lashes out at him and blames him for his grief, and um, kind of thinks of him as a villain. And Death is like, it's not my fault. Like, I didn't pick this job for myself. I was just kind of created as I am. And like, no one really ever thinks about me or has any empathy for me. Um, so yeah, that blows up. I thought like him going to therapy and like doctor's appointments all the time and kind of having to run like mundane errands could be very funny and revealing. Like I have him go to the dentist a handful of times which I just think is like very funny because like you wouldn't think Death would have to go to the dentist. And also he's kind of like, he's like a bureaucrat that you'd want to make fun of a little bit. He's not the omnipotent, um, omnipresent Death that's typically rendered dramatically. Um, I actually had this idea originally back in like 2020 or 2021. Right after I graduated college, I was watching The Seventh Seal by Ingmar Bergman, and the protagonist is playing chess on this like picturesque beach against death, and like it's this like great kind of metaphor that you can't cheat death. Um, but at the time in my real life, I went to film school, and a lot of my friends' film projects were being kind of overhauled or like translated for to be done like virtually over Zoom, which was so lame. But I was like, it got me thinking about how you can take one idea and change it into something else. And I just started thinking about I'd really love to have the dramatic character of death be in like a screenplay or a book, but how would you do it today in like a contemporary setting? And what I came to was like, rather than playing chess on this picturesque beach with these kind of high stakes or whatever, he'd probably be kind of isolated in his own apartment playing chess online against people. And I thought that to be very funny. Um, okay, so he's playing chess online. He tries to go to therapy. It doesn't work. Chapter 3 it's fully revealed that he actually is death personified, and you get to see like what his job is. That it's kind of orchestrated like an Uber Eats driver's job would be, where it's all through his phone. It operates through like an algorithm. He doesn't really know who runs the algorithm or how it works. But he just has like 10 appointments a day approximately, and he's told to show up at these places, and he'll like take a picture of someone, upload them, and confirm them. And when he confirms them, like they pass away, and he is completely numb to the process because he does it 10 times a day, and he's been doing it for all of eternity. And so once he's fully revealed that he's death over the first 3 chapters, that kind of operates as the opening hook, while also introducing, this window conflict that he has as like kind of the thematic through line. From chapters 3 to 6, he goes on a couple other like appointments, and you start to see his day to day, and he kind of reflects through like cultural commentary after going on these jobs, about the meanings of different types of death or whatever. Like he meets one woman who's had an abortion. He meets one guy whose brother's passed away, and he's kind of able to reflect on, what's important, what's not. He's very cynical. It tries to be pretty funny. And then in chapter 6, he gets the window kind of makeshift covered with some blackout curtains and a blanket. And he's sitting in his apartment, and he's playing online chess on his phone, and he suddenly loses, and he has this like full ego death, and he freaks out, and he starts to, it's very symbolic because like if he loses in if he loses in chess, this would be the first time he'd ever lost in chess. It shows, it's kind of like a joke, but it shows like that he's played 120 billion games of chess. That's how many people approximately have existed over the course of human history. So, it's, again, borrowing that analogy from Bergman's Seventh Seal, and the idea that you can't cheat death. But he loses for the first time. And so he's totally freaking out, and he's like, if I can lose in chess, does that mean like I'm just a crazy person who thinks that they're death, and I, actually have schizophrenia, or, does that mean I can die? Blah, blah, blah. And then he realizes like he's probably just been cheated, that someone's probably hacked the mainframe. There's no way he could ever lose, whatever. So he demands to have this in-person meetup, and he goes to the park with this, intending to meet this person. And there's a couple like false starts. He thinks it's going to be this old waspy guy. It's not. He thinks it might be this homeless guy. And then he's finally like, okay, they didn't show up, until he sees this beautiful, like 22-year-old girl setting up this like very picturesque, picnic with lots of food. And she's late, and she's like, sorry, I'm late. I thought it might be fun if we had a picnic together. She's very in the moment. She's not at all like disgusted or afraid of him, and I think he's not fully conscious of that, but he's kind of like, what's wrong with this girl? And at the same time, he's also thinking like, this girl's cheated me, so I need to, win this in-person rematch. So they play again in person. He beats her. She's like, have the picnic with me. He's like, no, I gotta go. Whatever. And he thinks he's totally redeemed himself. Then he goes on with his day-to-day life. It goes back to some B-story stuff. He's like, has some more kind of misadventures. And then he suddenly realizes one night late at night that even if he's proved them to be a cheat by beating them with an in-person rematch, on paper, they're still technically tied 1-1. And so he actually needs to play her again and beat her again in order to be, superior on paper. So he texts her on the chess app and, all this stuff and whatever, and asks for another rematch, a rubber match or whatever. And she agrees. And then he has all these logistical problems, and where he's trying to be very petty and make her wait a little bit. But then he breaks his phone, and he has to go to the Apple store, and the Apple store people are giving him all kinds of trouble, and then he ends up being too late and missing their rematch. So he's totally botched it. Through his own terms, he's kind of forfeited the third match, and now he's beneath her on paper again. And he goes back to his day-to-day life, and he goes to a fraternity party where there's a hazing incident, and a student has died, and he sees her like waiting in line, like in the costume for the party, and she's like very tongue-in-cheek with him. She's like, you didn't have to make up an excuse to see me again. If you wanted to ask me out, just ask me out. And he's like, I wasn't making up an excuse. Like, I just wanted to play you in chess again. And so it's kind of the start of this romance, but he can't really admit it to himself that he would ever like somebody or would ever, be interested in a friendship or a kind of love interest. So he's, very conflicted from this point on. He clearly wants to go out with her, but is like also like, he has this big ego and this defense mechanism that he's better than people. So he keeps having to convince himself with through being like, I'm just doing it for sport, or I'm just doing it because she's so weird. I don't actually like her, kind of thing. And they go on a couple dates together. She's like very wonderful, and they have a lot of arguments because she is a painter and lives in the moment, and like basically I would say she almost kind of embodies like an anima figure, or like kind of like a perfect like feminine, a little bit, not to the point where it's like ridiculous, or like cliche. But he is like death incarnate, so like characters are kind of like emblematic. And eventually he finds out that she is a religious Christian, and that's the reason that she's able to tolerate proximity with death so easily, is that she has this like, she has this promise of the afterlife, and so death does not seem so bad to her. Whereas like a lot of other people don't have that when they see him. They're completely disgusted and whatever. And it's also revealed that her father has passed away, and she's very curious about death, or Joe. The main character's named Joe, even though he's death personified. She's very curious about Joe because her father has passed away, and because she's a religious Christian. But unbeknownst to her, and it's been kind of foreshadowed up until this point, you know, Joe really hates Jesus Christ because Jesus Christ, throughout the course of human history, is like the one person who has cheated death and transcended death and has basically made Joe to look like an idiot. Um, so it's almost kind of where Joe's like trust issues come from with humanity. It's or like it's almost as if you could treat like Jesus Christ from Joe's perspective as like an old like relationship that he has trust issues over, and him and Elle go back and forth. He's falling in love. He can't even really like rationalize why he's falling in love, and it's so confusing that he goes on this crazy rant alone in his room, getting drunk, and tries to chalk it up to like an economic principle. Um, what is it that yeah, he tries to chalk it up to like economics and like put like a certain kind of logical spin on it. Um, that they're both getting something out of the arrangement, and so the sum is greater than the two parts, and that's actually what love is, and it's all quite rational, and whatever. Um, and then Elle asks Joe to go to work with him on like a ride along, basically, and um, he takes her along, and he's really excited that she wants to like spend the day with him and know about him. But from her perspective, she's trying to learn about what death is and her own life and what happened to her dad. And they go on this job, and they're kind of bickering. She's clearly nervous. Um, and he, confirms a woman who's in her apartment, and basically Elle can't handle it. And it's all too much, and it's too unfeeling, and Joe doesn't say two words to him. She gets very caught up on how it's done and kind of the like unfeeling, chaotic nature of the universe, And the woman has a pet cat, and she's like, what do we do with the cat now? She has all of these like very practical questions that Joe never really thinks about or even cares about. So it throws them into this big fight, and she basically says to Joe, like, it's not what you do that's so horrible. It's how you do it and your perspective and how you treat people so horribly. And that's why I can't stand to be with you. And they have this big breakup. And Joe goes back to his room, and he's kind of destroying things. He's like, I was right about love. I was right about women. And then Elle shows up and apologizes and is like, I'm so sorry. They both had their own reasons for the fight. And she's like, but please tell me about Jesus Christ. And this is about 20 chapters into the 32 chapter book. And it's all been linear up until this point. But I take one chapter and I do a flashback back to when Jesus Christ was alive. I was kind of, I guess, maybe influenced or inspired by The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis and The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. And it goes back to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, but from the perspective of death personified. And he's basically like, talking about how unappreciated he is. He talks about how bad it was for humanity at that point in time, how it smelled awful, how there was no sewage, how people were like not smart, whatever. And then he comes to seeing Jesus Christ crucified, and Jesus Christ is like so loving and charismatic, and is like the only person to ever take an interest in death himself, who's like not so self-involved at the moment of their own death, that they're totally like focused inward or fearful. And so death is kind of shell-shocked by this, and he's not able to confirm Jesus Christ. And he goes and sits with him in the cave where he's buried, and Jesus Christ wakes up so long after not being confirmed, and he and Joe sit in the cave together, and Jesus Christ is like, we need to go get you the appreciation you deserve with humanity. Let's go out there together. And Death is kind of like worried about him, but also like, he's just excited for someone to take an interest in him for once. No one has ever taken an interest in him in the course of human history in this way. Like, not him personally, other than being upset at him. And so after 3 days, they leave the cave together, and Jesus Christ goes before his followers and like, I have risen from the dead. And I think Joe in that moment interprets it as like Jesus Christ is taking all the credit, even though Death himself is the like powerful one who allowed him not to die. So Joe strikes him dead right there on the spot, and he has this like trust issue from then on out, over the rest of the course of human history. And that's kind of where all of his relationships and trust issues came from, and you get to see that 20 chapters into the book. And so he tells that to Elle, and she's kind of like shell-shocked and like, thanks for telling me, whatever. And he's elated because he's finally like fully gotten to be authentically himself and tell his story, and he has someone that he thinks cares about him enough to listen. And he's just so happy, and like finally he's fully broken through all of his fear and like fallen in love with her. And they've got this event that they're going to together. He's going to finally meet her friends. It's they're doing something called Midwinter, which is like a joke about midsummer because she has a Swedish roommate. They're just doing like, an inverse midsummer in the wintertime. And he's picking up flowers and coffee for her, and he's so excited, but there's kind of this undercurrent of dread, and he shows up to her place, and she's, taking her own life. And she gets to talk to Joe on his deathbed, on her deathbed, sorry, about why she did it, and it was basically that she couldn't keep the faith, and she always had this kind of desire to do it in her blood, and it was inherited from her father, which is supposed to be like, inherited from all of humanity. And he is totally destroyed by this because he's, after breaking through these trust issues that he had with Jesus Christ, he's finally managed to put himself back out there in love again after, over 2,000 years. So he's totally destroyed and shell-shocked. And up until this point in the book, it's also been alluded to that Death is actually that Joe is just a fragment of Death, that he's 1/15,000th of Death, because there's 150,000 deaths in the world every day. And so Joe goes on 10 appointments a day, and there's theoretically 14,999 other guys just like him, kind of roaming around, spread out uniformly throughout the world. But up until this point, we don't see any of them or get to meet any of them. And so Joe decides he's not going to confirm Elle, just like he did with Jesus Christ. He's going to sit there and wait for her to wake back up. And then another fragment comes knocking at the door, confirms her before Joe can say anything or do anything, and is completely unfeeling, just like Joe has been to all of the other appointments that he's had, throughout the world, throughout his life. And he's, basically destroyed himself again, even though it's another version of himself. And the guy kind of mocks him and makes fun of him and is like, nothing matters, bro, like, whatever. And that is the end of Act 2. That's the end of chapter 24 or 25 or so. So chapter 3 begins with this kind of like descent. He's like, he completely gives in to nihilism, drugs and alcohol. He's in his apartment. Nothing really matters. He's just drinking all the time. And he's run out of alcohol. So he's got to leave and get more alcohol immediately. he would Amazon it, but it's too late at night and whatever. So he ends up um, going to this bar, and he runs into his dentist, who is this woman. She's a female Filipino immigrant. He's had all these problems with crowns or whatever. He got ripped off by his previous dentist, who was basically breaking his teeth so she could fix them for him. And so he switched and went to, her name is Dr. Cruz. She's a female Filipino immigrant because he thinks like, a woman immigrant has too much to lose by ripping him off, basically. But then like a lot of stuff go wrong with his crowns, with her too, and he's very paranoid about her. But he sees her outside of her dentist environment, and it turns out, is like a total partier. She's doing drugs. She's fucked up. She's like, you got to come to this rave with me, whatever. He doesn't do drugs. He's never done drugs. And she gets him in the back of this Uber headed to a rave, and starts giving him like all of these drugs, just basically every drug. Starts making out with him. She's like, I always wanted to fuck you, Joe. And it's kind of this dark, like super hedonistic thing. He's brought into the rave. He's on drugs, just freaking out. He starts thinking about how like, he could totally die because he's taken too many drugs. And he's like, wait, I can't die. And she says to him, like, I know why you've been coming in to see me at the dentist, because the rest of your teeth are perfect. But she's like, I could tell you only come to the dentist because you're lonely, because you're immortal and your body heals itself. And it turns out like the first dentist was damaging his teeth so she could repair them, putting crowns on them. But because he's immortal, his teeth were growing back. And so when he went to Dr. Cruz, his crowns kept falling off, and she was confused. And he would always think that it was because she'd ask him if he'd cut down on, alcohol, smoking, sugar, whatever. And he'd be like, yeah. And then she'd look at his teeth, and she'd be clearly, confused about something. But it turns out she was confused because the rest of his teeth were perfect, like completely perfect. And he's kind of denied to himself that he goes to all these doctor's appointments because he's just lonely and like wants to connect with people. And that's the only way he could ever think to connect with anybody. And so they go back to her place. They sleep together. He's a virgin, so he's kind of imagining that it's Elle the whole time and thinking about how he never got to sleep with her and how sad it is and whatever. And he kind of comes to, after it happens, and they're both coming off of these drugs, and she freaks out on him, and she can't believe that she just fucked death. And so he goes on this like cold morning walk. He's completely at rock bottom, and he walks by this church that he's passed a few times earlier in the novel. And he basically blames everything that's happened to Elle on religion. And he's like, if she wasn't set up with the expectation that everything would be, that she would be saved, then the realization that she won't actually be saved wouldn't have killed her. And so he blames religion. He's so upset. And then this priest walks out, this very kind of unaffected, happy priest, very human guy. He walks into the convenience store next door, and he gets some Jewel Pods and like some Cheetos. And so Joe decides he's going to kill this priest by revealing to him that he knew Jesus Christ, and Jesus Christ is not the Son of God. But when Joe tells the story to the priest, it is a literal rendition of what happens in the Gospels, that Jesus Christ rises from the dead. And so the priest is like, thank you so much. You've like confirmed what I've held faith for my entire life. Like, I no longer need to have faith. Now I know for certain that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And Joe's basically like, you're not listening to me. You're not listening to me. The idea being that like real faith, kind of metabolizes all logic, and that's what Joe has interpreted to be proof that Jesus Christ is not the Son of God. For this priest, it is actually proof that he is the Son of God. And Joe starts freaking out, and the priest kind of realizes that he's hurt about Elle, and he reassures him and tries to comfort him. And then, because Joe is fixated on windows, he looks up and sees that it's light in the church, despite there not being any windows, except for stained glass windows, which a lot of Catholic churches have. And the priest is like, that's the great thing about stained glass, is it lets all of the light in without having to look through to the other side. And that's kind of like, this metaphor for like a religious window with like, you get to experience everything of life, and you don't have to kind of torture yourself by, this awareness of mortality almost. And then that kind of begins Joe's healing process a little bit. He goes back to Elle's house, her senior house at her college, and she was a painter. So she's painted all of these Rukin figures across all of her walls in her bedroom, and it's kind of devastating that they've been painted over. It's been a few months since she's passed away, and he meets her roommate, Ingrid, the Swedish one. And they get to talk about Elle together, and she's like, I wish you would come to the funeral. She's like, I have some of Elle's things. I want to show you this. And Elle's a Rukin figure artist. A Rukin figure is like a landscape painting where the center of it is someone's back. So a famous one is David Caspar Friedrich, Wanderer Above the Sea, or the Salvador Dali Figura a una finestra, which is like this woman looking through this kind of blue window over the sea. Anyway, it's like a style of painting that allows you to experience a landscape from the perspective of kind of like a center focal point, like from the perspective of another person. And so Elle, in her room, has had these two paintings, one of her mother, one of her father, both of which have passed away, and they're both kind of revealing as to like the choices and struggles that her parents had to make. And so when Ingrid comes down with some of Elle's things, she has some sketches that Elle had done of Joe in the form of a Rukin figure. And so Joe takes those and he like really cherishes them and realizes, she really loved him a lot. Even though he kind of destroyed her. He destroyed her by, the one thing that allowed her to experience Joe was her religious faith, and he destroyed it by having to tell her like the truth, his truth, his experience. But Ingrid also has the cat that is from the appointment that Elle and Joe went on together. It turns out Elle had taken the cat home with her after her and Joe got in that big fight. And so Joe keeps the cat and names it M, because M comes after L in the alphabet. And then the very last chapter is just a day of Joe's new routine after having been transformed by his love for Elle and then loss of love for Elle. I guess that's kind of the central idea of the book, is like that I think the loss of love is such a transformative experience. And that's what happens to Joe. And, he has these 10 appointments just like he did before, but instead of kind of like smoking cigarettes and like walking in there drinking a Coke and, just kind of confirming the person as they fade off, he puts on a suit, he shows up to his appointments early, and sits with the person who's about to pass away, and he brings them flowers and listens to them, even though he used to think that it didn't really matter because the person was about to pass away. He now realizes that, it matters more than anything, and kind of does this to honor his memory of Elle and how it's changed him for the better. So Yeah, that's kind of a in-depth summary analysis book pitch for my novel, Love Begins with Elle. It's 112,000 words, which is about 450 pages. I think that's been kind of a jump scare for my submission process to literary agents. Um, but I really believe in it, and I think it's really great. And yeah, if you know any literary agents or publishers, or if you are one, please connect me with them or reach out to me. Thanks for watching.